Kia ora tata katoa, talofa lava ni sambulavi naka malolelei, talohani, namaste, ni hao, bonsoir, and greetings to everyone that have joined us this evening for what I am sure will be a very insightful and thought-provoking event. So as you all know, this event is focused on family violence in times of pandemic. We all know where the time that we have been through in the last 3 months. It hasn't been easy. There's been a lot of uncertainty, and for some of our women and some of our families, that's also being a time of difficulty in terms of some of their own individual experiences. And so this evening we have a great panel who will share their insights from their own respective fields. We have Jan Logie, who's the Under-Secretary, who has oversight of this really important piece of work, and she's driven some key initiatives through Parliament. We have the Chief Executive of Women's Refuge, who will also bring some excellent insights in terms of the work that the organisation is going through, and also some of the challenges and possibly opportunities that she can see going forward. And we have Mele, Wendt, member of New Zealand Order of Merit, who is also a white ribbon ambassador. And so it's a great privilege to have her here to share her own lived experience of family violence. Some of you might have read the story of her and her husband in the media in the last couple of years. And for her to have the courage and that sense of urgency and bravery to stand beside her husband to share that story, that's pretty powerful. So I'm looking forward to hearing her and her perspectives. And we also have Superintendent Tim, who's joining us from police to also share their perspectives. And I know that within their respective fields, they have so many different areas that they're working in, and so it's an absolute privilege to have you all. So this event, just to give a brief overview of where this has come from and why we are having this conversation, this corridor. This is the first collaboration between UN Women Aotearoa New Zealand and the United Nations Association of New Zealand and the Wellington branch to bring our collective efforts together to really hone in on a subject that is so pertinent right now. And, you know, it's to start the conversations to make sure that we continue to make the progress that had started pre-COVID, and we pull together our resources and we work towards delivering better outcomes for women and for girls. So you all know that the United Nations agreed 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those goals is around achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls, which is Sustainable Development Goal 5. And alongside that, a supporting theme is around partnerships to achieve those goals. So those are the two key goals that we've identified as really important in driving this collective effort to focus in on what is needed to really address violence against women, because New Zealand features quite prominently in global statistics. So we know that globally, 243 million women and girls aged between 15 to 29 have been subjected to sexual and or physical violence, often perpetrated by an intimate partner in the last 12 months. And this number is likely to increase as security, health, and money worries starts to heighten, and the strains are accentuated by cramped conditions and unemployment and the looming recession that is upon us globally and also domestically. And the emerging data shows that since the outbreak, violence against women have increased, and New Zealand is not immune. We've heard many stories of how this has become an issue. So really today is about starting the conversation, picking up on where things were pre-COVID, and really giving some more momentum to continue with the work that's being done, keep the traction moving, and make sure that the relevant parties that should be around the table progressing these issues are actually focused, and they know that these are a priority for not just for New Zealand but globally. And how can we show leadership at that global scale so that, you know, we can lead the charge and be seen to be leading in reducing violence against women and girls. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Julia to introduce all of our wonderful speakers for tonight. And I will come back again at the end of the session to provide some concluding remarks based on the key themes from our speakers. But I won't take up any more time because you're here to hear from the speakers. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Loretta. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia. I'm the president of the Wendt branch from UNANS, United Nations Association of New Zealand. I had prepared a little brief to say, but after Loretta's, I think she was amazing. So right now, I just want to highlight that it's an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to listen and reflect about family violence in times of pandemic, with such great speakers. Before starting the event, I just would have liked to briefly mention that we're going to cover all the questions at the end of the session, and then you can use the questions and answer function at the bottom. Now, to start the event, I would like to introduce Dr. Ange Jury, the Chief Executive of the Women's Refuge. Dr. Ange has been working in the domestic violence arena for over 20 years. She has fulfilled every role within Women's Refuge, from volunteer to advocate to management to board members. I work with her at the national office, and it's a pleasure to have you here, Ange.
Kia ora. Thanks for the invite to come and join everyone tonight. I feel like I've been bushwhacked a little bit because I get to go first. And I was going to build on whatever Jan talked about. So, oh well, it is what it is. I'm not going to take up too much of your time because I'm actually really interested in hearing people's questions. I want to hear about the things that you're interested in. So the two things that I will talk about though, two questions really. What did lockdown mean for Women's Refuge? First question. And what did lockdown mean for the women and children that need our services? Now the first of those questions is a relatively easy one. We know what it meant for Women's Refuge. We know that it meant we had to totally reorganise the way we do our work. We had to shift from communal safe houses to individual bubbles, which was a mission and a half. We had to move to a remote, or at best arm's length form of service delivery. And for anyone that's familiar with Women's Refuge, you'll know that that's a very, very foreign way for our kaumahi to do their work. It's very much a service that's based on care and compassion, and we do most of our best work over a cup of tea. So doing it this way was a huge learning lesson for Refuge staff. One of the things that I would say is that I'm incredibly proud of the fact that actually they all stepped up and service continued throughout that lockdown, albeit in a really weird and odd fashion, but the services were still there. So, and that's really what it meant for us as an organisation. But what did we actually see? We were lucky in some ways because we had warning, but we were anxious about that warning because what we were seeing from the international media was absolutely alarming reports of service spikes that honestly I doubted our ability to deal with those if they did occur. So that's what we were sort of ready for. And but what did we actually see? Well, like police, and I'm sure Eric will talk more about this when he speaks, we saw a wee bit of a spike early in the first few days, and then a little bit more in the first weekend. But that was followed by and large by a quite alarming level of quiet. We saw across the whole period a 35% increase in our residential services. we saw a very small increase, almost a flattening really, of our community service delivery. So what that meant is we weren't picking up there were no new community clients coming into the service, which really, when you think about it, that's actually pretty normal, pretty expected. People were locked up in their houses. So, we kept waiting for things to change. And I kept talking to media about the fact that we were waiting for things to change. All they wanted was blood, to be quite honest, which was an interesting experience. They didn't actually want to hear anything positive, which really I found really quite personally affronting, because there seemed to be a total lack of understanding that had we seen the sorts of things that they were wanting me to talk about, that would have meant a whole lot of women and a whole lot of kids being hurt, possibly quite badly hurt, having a really dreadful time. So I was actually quite pleased in the end to be able to say, yeah, nothing to see here, folks. Yeah, this is all quiet on the home front. So that spike in residential services, but a flattening of everything else. So what did that actually mean, or what did we take it to mean? And this is the harder question about what the lockdown meant for women and children, particularly given what we were still hearing from overseas. I was involved in several webinars with the global network of women's shelters. So women from Brazil and the UK and the US and all over the world. And they were all over the place too, in terms of what they were seeing. So I couldn't even take any real guidance from them. So what did it mean for the women and the children? Well, we simply don't know. That's the only real answer to that. And that any answer to that question is only going to emerge over time, and probably over a considerable period of time. One of the things that we know is that regardless of what actually happened during lockdown, New Zealand is heading into a period of recession. You know, even the most optimistic forecasts say that it's going to be unpleasant. Now, we know that times of recession are a perfect incubator for domestic and family violence. We know that rising unemployment and increased financial stress as a result, the sense of a loss of control over people's lives and a sense of depression and failure, that their plans have been destroyed, derailed. Things like people self-medicating to try and make themselves feel a bit better. The inevitable rises in mental health issues. All of those things, while none of them cause family violence, they all provide great conditions for it. So I think we have yet to see what might be coming at us. I am hearing from refuges at the moment that they're busy now, much busier than they expected to be. Whether or not that's the startings of a trend, that's a little bit hard to tell at the moment. I'm hoping it holds off a little bit and lets us get through winter, you know. What we do know is that over lockdown, the big issue for women was contacting services, actually accessing services. We know that protection order applications fell away by 50%. We know that calls to our crisis line fell away remarkably. and I understand to many other helplines as well, apart from the COVID health line, of course. What we tried to do over that period was to try and make sure that our contact channels were working as well as they possibly could. In very short order, we stood up a web chat function on our shielded site to give another option, and that proved surprisingly popular. So not massive numbers, but surprising. So it was clear to me from that actually people did want to reach out. They simply couldn't. And that makes sense. If you're locked up 24/7 with the person that's using the violence, unless you're going to happen to reach out to some random person at the supermarket and say, hey, help me, your chances of actually getting help, unless you wanted to push the panic button and ring police, were pretty remote. That worried me then, and that worries me now, of what was actually happening there that we didn't get to hear about and that police didn't get to hear about. One thing I'm absolutely and utterly sure of is that despite our Prime Minister exhorting everyone to be kind to each other, which was extremely good advice, however, one thing I don't believe is that suddenly everybody in New Zealand who had been using violence control over their partners suddenly stopped and decided to be kind. I simply don't believe that strains any notion of credulity. So we know it was happening. We just don't know the full extent of it. And really, at this point in time, the prevailing notion across the refuges, I've been to a couple of regionals over the past week, and the sense is that they are all sort of preparing for the worst and desperately hoping and smiling and saying, no, it's not going to be that bad. So trying to be very, very hopeful, but at the same time, really, really concerned. So at the moment, it looks like we have bucked the trend, if we're going to believe international reports, just like we have with COVID, and maybe, just maybe, that's a result of the fact that we did put a whole lot of stuff in place really early. We had a government that was prepared to make some hard choices and make them early, but they were also a government that were very, very quick to listen when we started saying, hey, look, this could be a problem. Very quick to listen and very quick to act. And thank you, Jan, for your part in that. And I think I will leave it there. I'm really interested, once everybody else has spoken, to hear people's questions. So I'm going to say bye for now and hand over to Julia to introduce Jan. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendt. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Jan Logie, is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary to the Minister of Justice, Domestic and Sexual Violence Issues. In Parliament, she has been a champion for people and family affected by domestic and sexual violence. She initiated a select committee inquiry into funding, especially sexual abuse and social service, and her workplace protection bill is designed to protect victims and reduce the significant economic impact of domestic violence. Thank you for being here, Jan.
Kia ora, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel and to acknowledge Ange and Mele and Eric. It's a pleasure to get to present with the three of you. And I think while Ange may have wanted me to go first, I just want to say I think that was the perfect place to start, and that it is really important to ground any of these conversations in what's happening in our communities and the experience of women and kids. So thank you for doing that. And which also is, I really want to acknowledge, before I speak about what government's done over this time, I want to just acknowledge of anyone who may be watching this webinar who is currently experiencing domestic violence or was through the lockdown, that acknowledging the unacceptability of that and our hope and absolute belief in every single person's right to safety, and hope that they take confidence from Ange in the power of great people being on the other end if you reach out for help, and also to acknowledge that the value of that help from organisations like Refuge for people experiencing violence or using violence, not refuge, though sometimes you do end up in that position, but people working with people who use violence, of really being able to help create amazing change for people, and also the work that those organisations have done in helping government improve what we do. And I've got to say, from my experience through COVID, this has been the best example of government and community partnership that I've seen. And I am very, very grateful and impressed by the expertise and the knowledge within our communities. And I hope as a country we can all really value that, because we all gain a lot from it. So tonight I wanted to speak, it's a bit more high level, but just some of the research that we had about what we thought we would expect and the things to watch out for, and that we got that advice in kind of late March before going into lockdown, and it was looking at those overseas experiences like Ange was talking to, as well as looking to some of our own domestic crises like the Christchurch earthquake. And so we were expecting a dramatic increase in reporting, but we took lessons that had been learnt from those situations, and the key things that we were told to be watching for, that we needed to be very careful of, were to ensure that there was clear communication about what help was available, and to ensure that there was regular communication between specialist service providers and government agencies, and to get clear messages from government that family violence and sexual violence was still being taken seriously, that this wasn't unimportant or less important than our response to COVID, and ensuring that there was financial support for victims to be able to access housing or transport or emergency supplies, and that information protocols and tools for a new frontline, as well as our like getting that advice for refuges and being able to how to adapt, as well as for the services who've been working with people using violence in the past. And so that research, as well as there was a pandemic working group, I think was the name that it ended up with, that I think was initiated possibly by Refuge, but from the community, that then came in as a partner for government to provide that feedback about what people were seeing in their communities that was working and wasn't working, that made sure that housing became, as an example, an area of specific focus, that the emergency housing that people maybe end up in, that we had to create protocols to make sure people weren't put in the same place that the person who'd been harming them was being put in, that actually there was appropriate support around people, those kind of things that when people develop policies at a agency level, doesn't necessarily get thought through, and you only get the ability to do that when you hear from the ground and are able to work those things out. And that there were essential needs packs that were put together. And one of the things I was really and delivered to women and children through refuges, but also through, at times, whānau ora providers and other community organisations. And one of the things I loved was that the Ministry for Education was part of that and provided like a full kind of school stationery kit for kids, as well as laptops, so that if there was a safe space or a quiet space for them to be able to engage in school, that they had those resources to do that, which hasn't been able to be part of our response up to this point. So I was really inspired by it, and that NGOs and kaupapa Māori providers actively reached out to people. So the refuges would be calling women who they'd supported in the past and to check in on them. And that was done in a variety of ways. And there was also training for the civil defence and emergency staff, very basic training. But when they were going and doing wellbeing checks on people in the community who may have been at risk, that they had basic kind of skills to be able to identify and respond to family violence, which helps us actually start to all be working together effectively, and hopefully in that knowing their limits. And work was started with the supermarkets and some pharmacies around providing new avenues for people to disclose and reach out for help when there are times where their options for reaching out had become limited by lockdown. And a coordinated prevention campaign was created that you'll see on your TVs now, as well as a specific one online called #CatchYourself from Pacifica prevention workers. And so this is some of the kind of snapshot, but a huge amount of work at a local level of reaching out to people. And I absolutely echo what Ange said about we don't know, and we are expecting this to be a long-term project, that we are monitoring data on a very regular basis from community organisations and government agencies to try and work out and identify early if there are problems in our response, and to be able to track if there's a problem. And because we absolutely believe if we've come together as a country to ensure the safety of everyone, this is a safety issue just as much as COVID. And I really do have a sense that as a country, we have not eliminated family violence, and I love the idea that maybe we can all get focused on eliminating family violence in the same way we did COVID, if only it was that simple. But I do believe we are in a place where there is a cultural shift that we can lean into and embrace around connectedness and shared responsibility that will, I do believe, help us in an ongoing way towards ending family violence in this country. And I did hear from somebody in the UK who was looking at comparing international responses, who was saying that between different regions in the UK, there was a significant difference in levels of reported violence. If there wasn't community outreach, the levels were much higher, and that they were, so it's possibility that the fact that things didn't go through the roof here in terms of reports and the extremes of the violence were because of our organisations on the ground actively reaching out to support people. And we can't confirm that, but I'm just going to, at this moment, again, just take that as something, as a seed of hope, and really, again, acknowledge the amazing work in our communities.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to be answering all the questions at the end of the section, but please keep writing Our third speaker is the National Manager Prevention for Police. He assists the Commissioner of Police in driving the development and implementation of New Zealand Police Prevention First strategy. He also leads the police deployment model, command and coordinator centers, tasking and coordination, harm reduction, family violence, victims and youth justice, development and education, and community neighborhood teams, mental health partnership, and alcohol harm reduction. Please join me to welcome Superintendent Eric Tibbott.
Kia ora tātou, can you hear me? You can hear me. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here tonight and to speak to you on in terms of family violence. But before I do that, I'd just like to acknowledge the previous speakers, Ange Jory and Jan Logie and also Mele. But in particular, Jan and Ange, I've known for some time now, and I'd just like to talk to the passion they have and the commitment to eliminating family violence in New Zealand. And it's a privilege working with and for both of them. I thought what I'd do is to take us on a bit of a journey from the police perspective, because I have sort of grave concerns that we are just starting to understand the impact of COVID. And as this year goes on and the following years, we're going to see an increase in family violence and also mental health, which impacts in that same space. And so some of the things I want to talk around is, you know, what are we currently seeing in terms of, from a police perspective? Police talk about family harm, and the reality is it's family violence, but police talk about family harm because what we want to do is to change the perspective and the behaviors of our frontline staff. So no longer are we just concerned with capturing evidence to prosecute somebody. What we really need to do is to understand the underlying issues, gather as much information as possible to share with our partners. So when you start looking at the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey 2019, we know that only 24% of victims of violence report incidents to police. And of that, 32% of that number have had at least one incident prior to reporting to police, meaning there's 77.8% who've been victimized multiple times. So that goes back to what Ange was saying about, do we really understand the full extent of, you know, family violence and victimization during the lockdown period? International research shows that there's a multiple episodes of family violence before a call is made to police. Now, as we move into the economic downturn, there's a lot of pressure, which we'll refer to a little bit later on families. So there'll be a lot of people out there who are exposed to family violence that it'll be the first time for them, and maybe not the first time they reach out to police or another agency. In terms of New Zealand Police and what we're doing, we've worked really hard in ensuring that our people that attend incidents are thinking beyond the incident. And we've invested in some training and technology. So police now can record everything on a mobile device. So we've got information pushed to our police staff and it's recorded in that device. So we are informing our staff in terms of a risk assessment. We have a dynamic risk assessment based upon what we already know about families if they've been involved in family violence before. And then there's a dynamic assessment, the information we collect there, so our people can make real good choices. And then our training package, Eyes Wide Open, looking for underlying stresses and contributors to family harm. And our model is about preventing harm, taking every opportunity to prevent harm. New Zealand have invested in a safer family transformation program that's seen us change the way we intend and investigate family harm. Initial attendance and best understanding of the issues facing whānau. And I'd just like to mention the joint venture. So it's great to have the Under-Secretary leading the family violence, sexual violence. It shows that government is really invested in making a difference. And government bringing agencies together and making agencies accountable. I think this is just a fantastic direction and leadership by government bringing us together. So I know the Under-Secretary didn't mention it, but the joint venture includes Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Oranga Tamariki, Health, Te Puna Kokiri, Social Development, Education and Justice. And I mentioned police at the end with ACC and Corrections because we are a key player. But really, change can only be made by all these agencies working together collegially, sharing information, developing a common understanding of what's happening. So police are working at a community level with our partners, and we're working collectively, but we're still quite a way to go. Now, we've been an integral part of the integrated safety response models that are operating in Christchurch and the Waikato, and there's an evidence base behind that to show how effective they are. The Under-Secretary has taken us on a journey to integrated community response. So I think we've actually positioned ourselves in a way that in the aftermath of COVID and the recovery from COVID, we've got some really good, strong responses in place. In several locations from the police perspective, we've linked in with iwi and co-designed community responses, and we've implemented Whanaia Ngā Pā Harakiki, which is again a multi-agency community-based approach to reducing the harm in our communities. So the things are in place which will really put us in a great place post-COVID. Now, what I've done, I've gone and reached out to the New Zealand Police Evidence-Based Policing Team, which were established a year or two ago. They're connected with universities in New Zealand, and they also got contacts with the universities overseas to try to find out what the international feeling is in terms of family violence and COVID. So what we found is international consensus that there'll be increases in family harm over the lockdown period and the months and years following. However, it's difficult to quantify the increase in demand. And it's also challenging in the New Zealand context because we're one of the first countries to relax lockdown conditions. We've had some of the most stringent restrictions in place. And it's also difficult to find examples that have had a similar effect internationally on economies and the psychology. So in New Zealand, at a national level, there's been little change in overall volumes across total family harm demand when comparing the days following the implementation of the alert. So we were looking at a period 24th of March to the 8th of May and comparing that with the 1st of January to 23rd of March. But we have to remember that this is only police stats. And as we know, there's a lot going on out there that we don't know. And there's a lot of people who report to other organizations. And so Ange will have a view of what was happening there, what might not be quite the same view as police, but this is when we get together collectively and we understand. So I suppose from an emergency management space, we talk about a common operating picture. What is the common operating picture for the joint venture and all our agencies in terms of family violence? But although we say that there was little change overall, and it goes back to what the Under-Secretary was saying, there are differences in different locations across New Zealand. We have to really understand what that means. So for New Zealand, Northland and Eastern had a slight increase of 2 family harm occurrences every day per 10,000 head of population. So we need to understand what's happening in those locations and why they are, going against what we would see as the norm. Another indicator of the impact of COVID on the environment, the family violence environment, for me was to look at the police safety orders. This is an order a police officer can impose on an individual to separate parties and give the victim time to put some more protective measures in place. What we've seen is in Wellington and Auckland, it was notable for these 2 locations that the percentage of police safety orders breached increased, and this was different to everywhere else. And so both in New Zealand and internationally, the trends on reported domestic violence are mixed. We went overseas and had a look at what was happening in Australia, and researchers in New South Wales examined recorded police crime for March, domestic violence, they call it over there, during the social distancing measures, and found no change. However, if you go to Spain, Spain's reporting suggests slightly different. So their service providers are recording and receiving considerable higher demand, and their demand is ranging from 47 to 700% increase. But the reports to police have decreased. So now police are reaching out to other agencies and not necessarily police. In the UK, they've seen an increase. They're up 24% and a spike in reporting when the lockdown was lifted. And then the UK government looking at a strategy for domestic violence, both in post-lockdown and looking further. And I think, to be honest, having worked in the UK and now worked here, I think the UK could learn some lessons from the approach we've taken, the joint venture, the family violence, sexual violence approach that this government has put in place. We had a look at the joint venture dashboard 1st of May, and that very much like police said that we haven't seen a significant increase in demand, but there was one notable exception from a partner agency, and this was a Hey Bro, which is a support line for men who feel they may hurt a family member, and they saw a large increase across lockdown and no decline in alert level 3, and that really, I think, adds value and support to the approach we've taken. So we're not just looking at what support we can provide to victims, but what things can we implement and support perpetrators. So if a perpetrator understands that they're reaching a threshold where they may, lash out at a family member, where can they go? And Hey Bro is an example of that. Demand across the sector is variable. Some providers see a large increase and others normal demand. So again, it's disparity across the country. And then we did a rapid review of international research, and this was based upon previous infectious diseases, epidemics, and global pandemics. And we wanted to look at the impact on family violence, women, and children. The authors of the reports that we read looked at different patterns which may affect violence against women and children. Not all will be relevant to New Zealand, but when you start going through some of these, what I'll go through in a minute, you start to compare them to what we're likely to see post-COVID. So economic insecurity, poverty-related stresses. And now we're starting to see a downturn in the economy. We're starting to see organizations downsizing, people being made unemployed. The quarantine and social isolation, we've gone beyond that, but we're still isolated from the rest of the world. So what would impact would that be? Exposure to exploitative relationships due to the changing demographics, reduced health service and availability, inability of women to temporarily escape abusive partners, and violence perpetrated against health workers. So there are a range of signals there that we can look for, which will indicate that we're likely to see an increase in family violence. And there's also a large body of literature which focuses on risk factors on intimate partner relationship, including homicide. And they talk about substance use, dependence, and unemployment. And we think unemployment, substance abuse, where's that going to lead? So these are some of the things that we are likely to see as we go forward. So all the signals is that there's going to be an upsurge in family violence. We noted there's a United Nations Population Fund report which is predicting a 20% increase in domestic violence across UN member states based upon the average 3-month lockdown. And internationally, that's 15 million additional cases. And then if we're saying we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, 24% reporting, there's a substantial issue in terms of family violence across the world and New Zealand. Is police equipped for the increase in family violence? Well, over COVID, we moved rapidly, looking at the way we operated to build reassurance capacity within our communities. The increase in capacity sees us well placed to prevent harm in our communities and meet potential demand. But the thing is, we are just one government agency, and it is the holistic approach. What we need to do as we go forward is to need a more scientific approach to understand where the demand and vulnerability exist and where investment should be placed. So one thing police is doing is we're looking to develop a prototype vulnerability model. And the model is intended to be forward-looking, incorporate a broader assessment of vulnerability based upon a wider range of information and factors. And the intention is for that model to inform a proactive approach to projected changes in family harm based upon early intervention. So ideally, we want to use a combination of police and non-police data. So if you bring in what Ange knows, you bring in what other agencies know, bring it all together, we've all got access to a system where we can, collectively understand what our environments look like, what our capacity is to deal with this, we'll be in a far better position. But we should never lose sight of the story behind the statistic. And this is one thing I always tell my people. We are forever inundated with OIAs, official information requests, and people are asking for stats. Is crime going up? Is crime going down? But in particular, family violence, we should never lose the fact that behind every stat, there's a family. So families should be in a safe, loving, nurturing environment, but that's not always the case in New Zealand. Far too many women and children are living in constant fear of abuse, aggressive and violent behavior perpetrated by the person who is supposed to care for them. And for me, that really sums up the nature of family violence, and we have to change it. We're on a journey. we've positioned ourselves really well, but we need to start looking and projecting forward to understand the impact of COVID and the impact on not only New Zealanders, but internationally on our people over the world. I think that sums it up for me. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Mele. Now, to close the event, I would like to invite the New Zealand Order of Merit for Service to the Governments, the Pacific Community, and Women, and the White Ribbon Ambassador, Mele Wendt. She has a past lived experience of the family violence, which she and her husband publicly speak about. Having survived a turbulent period of over 20 years ago, they share the particular factors that enable the marriage to become violence-free and to thrive. Thank you for being here, Mele.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, talofa lava, and I greet you in all of our sacred languages of the world. I've just gotten quite nervous, so I just had to do a little bit to relax. Okay, I guess, yeah, I really want to tautoko what our previous three speakers have talked about, and to thank them for their wonderful leadership and sheer diligence in their work in the family violence area, especially in the COVID environment. And I just want to tautoko all of the comments that you've said already. I'd like to start by just reminding ourselves about why family violence occurs and the key driver. And research conducted across the globe has identified two core factors that drive violence against women and girls. And these are the unequal distribution of power and resources between men and women, and adherence to rigidly defined gender roles, or what it means to be and live as masculine or feminine. Most of us do not hold attitudes that support violence against women, but there are widespread beliefs and attitudes that perpetuate gender inequality. For example, I read about a survey in 2017 in Australia that showed 1 in 5 Australians, both men and women, thought men should take control in relationships and be the head of the household. And over 25% of Australians thought women prefer a man to be in charge. And I think we could say that the stats would probably be similar here in New Zealand. There are obviously other drivers and factors that contribute to domestic violence, and these vary from individual to individual and situation to situation. But I think the common factor is the rigid ideas and attitudes that predominantly men have about gender roles and women. It's also important to remember that violence against women is not always physical, that there are other forms of abuse like verbal abuse and threats, social isolation, limiting access to money. And these can severely damage women's self-esteem, independence, and well-being. So in sharing a little bit about my experience, Ete and I, my husband and I, have been married for 26 years. And the physical violence that we went through occurred in the first 4 years of our marriage. Without going into too much detail, because I just don't have the time, in that first period, there were about 6 violent incidences in total. And the first one occurred only 4 months after our big wedding. And I was in absolute shock that Ete was capable of this, because I'd never encountered violence in any of my previous relationships. And he had shown no signs of being violent leading up to our wedding. It took me 2 years and about 5 violent episodes to actually call the police. And this supports the statistic that Eric talked about. It often takes multiple occasions and quite a long period of time for victims of domestic violence to actually make the call to ring the police. But I have to say that this was the most effective measure that curbed Ete's violence. There were 2 court cases, and the second court case saw the judge telling Ete that if he hit me one more time, he would serve time in jail. And this was a huge wake-up call and became a really good deterrent for him. There was also lots of relationship counselling, and Ete got individual counselling, psychological counselling, and he went to men's anger management groups, etc. There was a long period of separation. And after reconciling, our solution, our key solution to be together, was to be together but live apart. So for 9 years, we were very much married and committed to each other, but we lived in separate residences. I lived on this side of Island Bay and he lived on this side of Island Bay. So why was Ete violent? Well, there were various reasons, including high levels of stress of having a young family with little children. We were a blended family, and when Ete and I married, we had 3 little children, and they were 3, 5, and 7 years of age. So having a young family, step parenting was a biggie, having bills to pay and a mortgage, and not being very happy in his job, etc. But fundamentally, it came down to 3 key things. Growing up in a culture and environment where smacking, hitting, resorting to physical means was commonplace and normal. And as the eldest son, Ete was physically disciplined a lot growing up, and he saw some family violence around him, not in his parents' marriages, but in the wider family village and society. This was in Samoa. So violence was quite normalized. But also, very importantly, the psychological baggage or trauma from some things that had happened to Ete as a child were affecting him in adulthood. And one of these things was abandonment issues. And these psychological issues or trauma could trigger him to lash out. But also, growing up in a male-privileged patriarchy with toxic masculinity and misogynistic attitudes, that I alluded to earlier. So because of all of this, and because I was a strong woman who expected equality and who stood up for myself, the violence resulted. It took Ete a lot of effort to develop the advanced tools to effectively and express himself, and to manage his anger, and to work through and heal the psychological issues. His attitudes obviously have changed significantly, seeing and treating me as an equal partner, relinquishing some of that patriarchal power, not having to be the man all the time, and also sharing the domestic duties and doing more around the house. And I have to say, sometimes I'm guilty that I don't actually do my share of the household chores. But anyway, but together we've both developed better ways of operating as a couple, and over time we've learned to be more accepting of each other and our faults, and we've developed better strategies to manage friction and disagreement. But at the most fundamental level, it's been the immense love and respect that we have for each other that's kept us together. For a long time, our marriage has been settled and content, with only minor tiffs every now and again. However, in the COVID lockdown, things did come to a head, and we had a massive argument that went on for 3 days, and it occurred in the 3rd week of lockdown, which apparently is often the week in entrapment or confinement when the shit hits the fan. And I know quite a lot of other people who had their relationship issues occur in that 3rd week as well. Anyway, what happened was Ete hassled me about drinking, and he argued that I was drinking too much. I was drinking every day, and that it was becoming a real problem. And I was in denial, and I said, no, I'm not drinking that much. Everyone else is doing it. It's in control. And because I sort of was in denial and I didn't accept his criticism, that just made it worse. And anyway, we had this massive argument. There were obviously increased levels of anxiety and stress. And I know that Ete was really missing his grandson. And of course, as everyone knows, because we all experienced it in lockdown, life was really just quite different. Anyway, we got through that episode and everything's been fine ever since. I thought I'd end by just talking a little bit about White Ribbon. And just so that we're reminded about White Ribbon is, so it's the global movement working to end male violence against women and girls. And White Ribbon in New Zealand drives a social change campaign aimed at transforming attitudes around men's violence. And it offers men the opportunity to be part of the solution to ending this violence here in Aotearoa. So its focus is on primary prevention. So White Ribbon's response to COVID-19 was to provide positive information that could keep families safe when we were locked in. White Ribbon's overarching focus is on respectful relationships, which are based on equality between men and women, and flexible gender behaviour for all, which where having men breaking out of the man box and choosing their own masculine identity prevents their use of violence. And so what do we mean by respectful relationships? Well, these are based on non-violent communication, where men are emotionally aware and expressive, which gives them alternatives to aggression, and where there's enthusiastic consent for all sexual activities. Having willing participation is crucial to preventing sexual violence. Under COVID, families were effectively trapped in their homes, so it was especially important to remind men who struggled to control their emotions that they could choose alternative behaviours. With everyone confined together, these men needed to make decisions that fostered safety and happiness for their partners and children. So White Ribbon created simple behaviours to create a safe and happy lockdown. And the name they used for this initiative was Our House Rules, which had a double meaning of these are the behaviours we expect in our house, but also Our House Rules, yay, our house is the best. And the first behaviour or rule was, don't take it out on them, take a walk. So if you're getting frustrated, take 5 and go for a walk and help you clear your head. And certainly for me and everyone in our bubble during lockdown, regular exercise became absolutely critical to our mental health. I went walking for half an hour every day, and Ete, who's a big exercise buff, because that's very much a major way in which he keeps his mental health really balanced. He went to the gym and yoga several times a week, and so did our grown-up children live with us. The second rule was stay at home, but stay connected. Even if we couldn't meet up in person, it was important to stay connected. If you were getting worked up and you needed to vent, then call a mate. If you were concerned about someone in a bad situation, get in touch with them and check in. And also staying connected to organisations that offer support like Women's Refuge and Shine and others, and reminding people that they are still there, that those services are still there. The third rule was not scared spaces, shared spaces. So that in lockdown, it was important to set a good example to whānau and create a space where everyone felt safe, that home is better and more fun when everyone is happy, that we ought to minimise risks like drugs and alcohol, even though there might not seem like much else to do, and to think of various activities that whānau could do together. More generally, White Ribbon's ongoing campaigns are about challenging the unspoken rules. Am I going for time? And unspoken rules are the expectations that boys and young men inherit from society based on outdated ideas of what a man is and how he acts and how he should express himself. And even if we don't agree with them, these rules exist. So rules like be the man, toughen up, boys don't cry. And these unspoken rules help to reinforce the man box, which is a set of expectations that assumes men must always appear dominant, tough, and in charge. So White Ribbon has also had a huge focus on promoting respectful relationships, which also includes consent, and a huge focus on promoting healthy masculinity. And healthy masculinity is rejecting unhelpful stereotypes and unspoken rules about what it is to be a man or a boy, and it's about being kind, empathetic, finding peaceful solutions to problems, and it's about being free to express and act in ways that do not fit into gender stereotypes. To end, I'll just talk about what I think society or you can help in the fight against family violence and some advice. And obviously there's lots of things that I think people could do, but I think firstly, don't be scared to have the conversations about family violence, to reach out to people who you think might be experiencing abuse and to victims, and to offer your support. But also reach out to potential abusers who are displaying aggressive or sexist behaviours, and to call them out and offer support and assistance too. We as New Zealanders don't generally like to have these conversations because they're awkward, but they're also about shame. And many of us find it much easier to believe everything is hunky-dory or pretend it's not happening. And I think points that Jan and Eric have made earlier sort of reinforce this. As a society, we also write off and condemn abusers and perpetrators. And the model is, or has been, to remove the perpetrator and split families up. But I think the model needs to change. It needs to acknowledge that people who abuse have problems. They have trauma, addictions, financial problems, and they need to be helped through those problems. We also should be trying to keep families together, not to break them apart, to help couples work through the issues, and to provide them with the necessary support and interventions to help with the problems, particular in their particular circumstances. And in my view, there aren't enough support programs available for perpetrators and for couples and for family units experiencing violence. Last year, Ete and I spoke at a judges' conference, and there were 23 judges in the room from a particular region in New Zealand. They all said that the options available to them as judges when presiding over family violence cases to help perpetrators and couples were few and far between. So I think we could all advocate for more resources and problems in this area. And the best advice to give someone who's in harm's way is to speak out about it and to seek support to access all the services that have been mentioned, but really not to be afraid to call the cops. I reiterate that the one major thing to stop Ete's violence was the police and legal interventions, So, and the sooner they engage with a service or the police, the better. And of course, you can support and get involved in organisations working in the family violence space, like White Ribbon, like Women's Refuge, etc. And so anyway, I think that's enough from me, and I look forward to our talanoa and discussion. So, whakataitele lava, thank you.
Wonderful. Wow, that was that's a lot to take in, and just a diverse range of insights from so many different perspectives. And it is an absolute privilege that we've heard your different perspectives, and now we've got a few questions from our very engaged audience. So the first question comes from Carol Beaumont. Who this relates to Andrew's session. So I know that a number of streets, neighbourhoods set up support networks in the lead up to the lockdown. I wonder if that could have been a small factor in what you said about people knowing that they and their partners had someone that they could go to that was close by. Do you think that that might have been the reason for why that was the case, Ange? That there were small street networks?
I think it could have been, Carol, but I've got no way of knowing. I know there was a great deal of encouragement everywhere. We were hearing it really about how to look out for each other, and it was something I was talking about a lot too. You know, reach out, talk to each other, on and on and on. So I would like to think that maybe people were reaching out informally. Yeah, very hard to know for sure.
Yeah, and I think you all alluded to the fact that we won't know until we need some time to go before we know the full extent. The second observation comes from Aviva Gwenda, basically noting thanks for all of the Women's Refuge's work. So what did she say? She said, we unfortunately found that our family violence 0800 helpline was running at a significant increase through lockdown, which caused us some concern in a number of areas. We found ourselves managing an over 30% increase in our services. The response from government and other philanthropic organisations were indeed much appreciated. The team worked within an environment that was very different to anything we had dealt with previously. For example, the EQ and the mosque shootings, which enabled us to react in a way that we dealt with it before. But the length and the restrictions placed on the wider communities brought a lot of challenge, and they felt agencies and communities came together in a way not seen before, and the collaboration across our communities was brilliant. Long may it last, she advocates. She also mentions that the communication across sectors was also an incredible amount of work, and it was really important and valuable, and that the refuges and other agencies found themselves truly working in a spirit of collaboration with a true client focus. And I guess her question, she didn't ask the question, but I'll pose this on her behalf. Could agencies use the approaches that they've done to work collectively during lockdown to continue to address this issue and break down some of those agency barriers that always tend to crop up when we don't have a crisis. So, Jan Logie?
I think, and I really hope that all of us in their different positions are building in some time for reflection about what has worked well and positively and what hasn't. We certainly have been having some of those conversations within government, because I really want us to take forward the things that worked, because if they were working through COVID, I think they're going to work for us on an ongoing basis. And the sense of the collaboration and thanks, Eric, for raising about the joint venture, which I really should have, which is, you know, a new initiative in government. And I do want to acknowledge that this, because we'd been hearing in the research for a very long time that the government silos was part of the problem for people getting the help that they needed, and so we're trying to solve that. And I think all of the work that's gone on about trying to build those relationships across government and start to build the shared understanding meant that there was a place of readiness for government to partner with the community, and that we didn't have previously, and it's so essential in terms of the work. And there's some really interesting stuff as well about some of those lessons where I know that the people providing programs for people who use violence, and as well as women and children, previously they've been really quite isolated in their work. There hasn't been good professional development for them across the country, or even the ability or resource for them to be well networked. But come COVID and the discovery of Zoom, is that there were weekly meetings where the practitioners were coming together and sharing practice and helping each improve improve their responses to people and how to work in an online context, and including finding that some people were responding better in a online context to engage. They were engaging more than they were in a group in a face-to-face setting. So that's a lot of maybe extra than what you wanted, but I think the upshot is I'm very intent on us learning and carrying forward the things that have been successful.
Wonderful. Superintendent Eric, did you have anything to add?
No, just to state what the Under-Secretary was saying there. I mean, it was a key stroke bringing all the agencies together under the joint venture, because we all have responsibility, and prior to that we were working in isolation. And it's powerful when you bring a group of chief executives together and say you need to come together to share information and share responsibility and accountability to deliver. And the Under-Secretary keeps us all honest in what we do and keeps the pressure on, and hopefully she'll continue to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And I suppose that would also be extended out to engaging with the communities and relevant organisations that will have a lot to say in this space. We have a comment, again, a note of thanks and appreciation from an anonymous attendee. The team at the New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse did a great job in providing central information for NGOs and government agencies and the wider public during this time, and she's given us a link. We will include this and the rest of the collateral that will come out post the session, so thank you very much for your work in that space. We have a comment from Caitlin Helm. Kia ora. Lots of you are talking about very poignant literature and statistics, especially our New Zealand data. Are these reports available for the public and also for those who are listening? Yes, it will be made available. So if our speakers could send through the sources for the data and the stats and the evidence that you've mentioned tonight, if you can send it through to us, we will collect them all and send them out to those that have attended, and also through the UN Women and the UNAN's website. Another really great question here now from Janet Fanslow. What are we doing to build the capacity of the research workforce to address family and sexual violence, and to build the capacity of people to understand and utilize evidence-based practice? I would like to pick up that one. Mele, what do you think from your space? Because you picked up on a lot of research. Sounds like you did a lot of preparatory work and a lot of research.
No, I'm absolutely no expert. I can't answer any of these questions. So I put myself on mute now again.
Under-Secretary Jane.
I guess, and kia ora, Janet, huge fan. So just to acknowledge that this is ongoing work, and this is one of those areas that we know is going to be really essential to our long-term success. It's that link between research, but I tend to talk about it in terms of workforce capability, and that's as an example, which you'll know, and it's the understanding of the workforce in a much broader sense than what we've traditionally understood it, because we have our specialist agencies and we have the police, and we tend to understand that as kind of our key agencies, but there are also the people within, the Employment Relations Authority who might be hearing cases around access to flexible working arrangements in response to the domestic violence leave. There's also the health practitioners who get more disclosures than the police do. There's the teachers. So actually saving lives requires all of those people to know what their appropriate role is and to feel confident and doing that role, and for that all to be evidence-based, and that is central to our future success, and is something we are very much engaging with in government, but I can't give you an answer in terms of timeframes or even too much more in specifics right at the moment, but I had a meeting about it today.
Eric, did you have a few things to share?
Yes, I mentioned earlier on about police over the last 18 months, 2 years have established an evidence-based policing unit. We've employed some academics, we've got linkages with universities across New Zealand, and we've stretched beyond that. So we're still building our capability in that space. So we've got the evidence-based, the academic research, and we can task and ask for certain pieces of work to be undertaken, both internally in New Zealand and overseas for comparison. Now, more recently, we've got a national intelligence unit as well that starts to look at some of the information we've got, maybe target certain locations or people who are sort of prolific offenders in that respect. We've also, and it's still in the early stages yet, we have a task from what we call a national tasking and coordination meeting. So it's a strategic meeting with our executives, which task out various pieces of work. One is to establish a joint police and joint venture insights team. So that's using some of the capability that the joint venture have got and leveraging off what police have already put in place, so we have a better understanding of what's happening in the environment outside. But I'd go back to what the Under-Secretary said. This is about workforce capability. So there needs to be capability from an analytical sense, but also in the way our people behave and operate and deliver services outside there. So it's a small part of a bigger piece of work, which is building the workforce capability, I think.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, Under-Secretary. Several more questions have popped up since the both were responding to that question. I've got one here from Gillian Goyer. Do we know how successful the shielded site strategy was? It was used online by family planning and others to protect confidentiality. Do we have any ideas of how much disabled women and girls were impacted over this period? given rates of violence are higher in normal times. Dr. Ange, can I go to you for this one first to start
Yeah.
with?
The shielded site, in terms of pickup by websites, was extraordinarily successful. The number of people accessing it wasn't ginormous by any state of the imagination, but it was significant. I can't give you numbers off the top of my head, Jill. Sorry, I just can't remember. The thing that we really liked about it, and the thing that we think is going to become even more popular across time, is that we haven't had a real-time web chat sort of function before. And the fact that this one can be accessed totally confidentiality, because it doesn't show up in a web browser. It just looks like someone's at the bank or at family planning or at the warehouse. I think that, and having that staffed 24/7 by people, trained, skilled people, I think is going to be useful, and we're going to be keeping that one running. Maybe coming to talk to you about it, Jan, at some stage once we start running out of money for it. In terms of disabled women, I haven't heard anything. I haven't heard. It's not a question I can answer. I know there were serious concerns raised throughout lockdown, actually, by the Human Rights Commissioner and by various others, but I heard nothing more. I do know that we were, because we weren't utilising our safe houses, most of which, to my shame, aren't accessible, we were over lockdown utilising motels and Airbnbs, which would have been accessible. As far as I'm aware, we didn't actually have any calls for residential service from any woman with disabilities, which is not to say that there wasn't bad stuff happening for them, because I'm sure there was. But sadly, they weren't reaching out to us. And maybe Eric has something that he could add to that potentially.
Yeah, and the thing I've added to that, I've got myself an action point, which is to go away and find out whether or not we can pull some data on women with disabilities who are victims. It's not the thing that jumps straight out at me as something that we will collect, but I've got it as an action point to take away. If I find we have got some stats, I'll feed it back into this webinar group.
That's fantastic, Eric. Jan, you go ahead.
Yeah. This is one of those issues that's a really significant challenge and an area of focus for me in my work in this area, is making sure that when we have a response to family violence, that it's a response that works for everyone, and that is not going to look like one response. And we, from my view, we have failed disabled women and children in our response to family violence in the past, and we have a lot of catching up to do. We had some really good meetings over the lockdown with the Disability Rights Commissioner and myself and Minister Martin and Minister Sepuloni and Williams to actually just start that work and to push through in terms of ensuring that there are appropriate responses. You may have noticed, and I think this was a really exciting initiative, is that for the first time to my knowledge, that in terms of COVID and the safety response information, there was a phone line that went through to People First. that is the organisation that supports people with learning disabilities that some people may understand as intellectual disabilities. And so that I don't think we've had before. But I don't think, and I've been trying to find this out, but I don't think it was the initiative of government. I think it was, again, created as a response by the community and provided within that framework, which is good. That's progress. And the resourcing was made available for that. In terms of the information, I think and as I suspect the person who asked this knows, it's not routinely collected. I have asked the police for data previously, and particularly in response, because the new family violence legislation particularly identifies forms of control that are typically used against people with disabilities. And we put those into the legislation to raise awareness, to drive a system response for people with disabilities. So far, the numbers aren't really showing up. And it makes sense to me. We need to create pathways for reporting that work for people with disabilities, and we need people to have the skills to be able to identify when somebody may be at risk. And that is not the same analysis as it is for what people understand generically as family violence. And I also want to point out that in terms of the LGBTQI community, in terms of higher risks of family violence as well, that showed up in the crime and victims survey, and again under lockdown, and particularly for young people in family environments where under increased scrutiny, without access to their friend groups, that risk in terms of violence for them was significantly heightened. And we haven't yet developed a resourced community response or pathways for those people. And then people from migrant communities. So there's a lot of work to do, but in terms of answer to that, while acknowledging that we are not there yet, that I really want people to know that this is important to us and we are working on this.
Thank you very much, Under-Secretary, for that very comprehensive response. It actually goes to the heart of the next set of observations and questions from Laurie Magnus, which essentially is that we know disabled women people are abused 2 to 11 times, depending on type of physical difference and different research done in different countries at different times, more than other women, non-disabled women. We know that UN repeatedly directs New Zealand to keep data on domestic violence and disabled women. We know that service provision for disabled women is not inclusive for all. I'm constantly told not enough funding when we ask service providers. And the questions that Laurie has asked, and I think you've answered this already, is how many disabled people asked for help? What are the processes in place to support someone whose support staff are the abuser? How much of the extra funding was used to make services inclusive, ensuring safety in residential care, refuge, data collection, etc.? So I've tried to crunch that very long observation and questions. Did you want to add anything else, Jan, to that one, or do you think that your previous response kind of covered it all?
I think my previous responses in that we can't give you the answers that, you know, I wish I could give you, but really very, very aware and focused on trying to shift that.
Very different question now from Maria Meredith. Unemployment rates are predicted to increase over time in New Zealand. Will this trend, among other factors, contribute to a further increase in family and sexual violence? And what does the research tell us? Eric, do you want to take a stab, given that you've got a research team now looking into trends?
Yeah, so on my introduction, I'm just getting my notes there. International research shows that unemployment is a trigger for family violence. And if you start to look at, and we could probably predict this, there'll be international research to show you the nexus between unemployment, economic downturn, and increases. So it was the, just find it here, the United Nations Population Fund prediction of 20% increase in domestic violence across UN member states. So if we take that on face value, we could possibly predict 20% increase in New Zealand. But whether that 20% increase is against the known reporting or the unknown, I don't know. Because what I'm, and this is just my sort of hypotheses, because there'll be a group of people who probably don't sort of feature in any of the government agencies as victims or perpetrators of family violence, but their world has changed. So if you think we've got a lot of small businesses in New Zealand who up until COVID were doing okay. And now after COVID, a lot of them are looking at a downturn, possibly unemployment, and the stresses of unemployment. How do they start to manifest? Does it start to manifest in, as Mele said, that, you know, abuse, verbal abuse, arguments, and escalation? So there'll be probably a new group of people that might be experiencing family violence. So this is where I was mentioning earlier on, and I think one of the presenters talked, one of the panel, not the panel, sorry, the question earlier on was around what research are we doing. We really need to get quick into this space, even if it's just some hypotheses, test those. What does our thinking look like, and what does our investment look like, and where do we need to invest? Because around the country, unemployment is going to have different effects on different groups. So if I think Northland, you know, you've got the forestry, you know, what does that look like? We know already unemployment in Northland is quite problematic. We know that, you know, alcohol and drug abuse is quite high. Socioeconomic. So what does that look like? So I think there's a lot of work we should start doing very rapidly and start predicting what the environment looks like in the next 6 months, 12 months. And I'd even push to go out 5 years, because if you start thinking normality doesn't come back to us until we've got a vaccine to COVID. And already Australia is saying the borders will be closed until 2021. There's a huge impact on the way we work and the way we operate. So I think our window is pushing out 5 years. And I think when you look back in history, was this something similar? I think in the late 50s, we had polio. And it took some time, maybe 2 years to develop a vaccine for polio. And it took about 7 years to, you know, effectively put it on the downturn and eradicate it. So we should be looking at, you know, those long windows. And I think with what we've got in place with evidence-based policing, the joint venture and all those things, we're in a strong position to get on top of it, but we can't take our foot off the pedal. And just going back to the last speaker, I think there's enough conversation in this webinar, and there's enough direction from the Under-Secretary for me to start looking at how we can capture some of this information about disabled people and their victimization and offending, that sort of stuff. So be assured that's something I'm going to take away from this group and see what we can do from the police perspective, and probably a bit broader as well.
Thank you very much, Eric. We are running out of time, but there is one vital question that I think we need to ask you all for your insights on. And this comes, it's two different people have asked a similar question. So Elaine Dyer and Adrian O'Hagan have mentioned the impact of family violence on children. So I'll take what Elaine has said. My concern is still support for the children who may have been exposed to the family harm during lockdown, and hearing from schools that at first many kids seemed to be, you know, okay, but now they're starting to talk about it. What are your thoughts for support for women? I know that you all, Mele, Eric, and spoke about the need to have more support for the perpetrators and the abusers. What about, you know, those who are observing the violence? Your thoughts, and for all the other questions that have come through, we've got a lot more. We will collate them all. We will share them with our panel members and come back to you all with responses, because you're all asking some very, very important questions that we need some responses to. So if you can answer that question with around support for children, that would be fantastic. Mele, how did you deal with it?
Oops, somebody's, oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice. In my first career, I was a high school teacher, and but I haven't been in the education system, the compulsory system, for a long time. But just in thinking about an answer to this question, I think schools play a huge role here in intervening if they see students and children who are potentially experiencing family harm. So I guess it's my opinion, and you know, as I said before, I'm not involved in this area at all, and I'm not involved in the education system. But greater links between schools and the support services that exist would be really, really important here.
Jen?
I'll try and keep it quick, but just to say, this is really critically important, because we know that for children living in situations where there's domestic violence, even if they don't experience direct physical violence against them to themselves, the impact is as profound as if they had. And we have put very little support into helping kids deal with that trauma and release that trauma and unlearn the lessons that they've learnt of living in the household where that violence has been modelled. So in the budget and the COVID response and recovery fund, there was money put towards services for children and youth experiencing violence of 13.3 million, because this builds on specific prevention interventions that were in the last budget, going in at an early childhood level, because we know, and the money that was announced around better education within the schools support, which includes relationship education and understanding of consent. So we know this is one of those areas that we need to keep building up, because it's essential for us getting to that point of eliminating violence and ensuring that we're not just leaving kids to deal with that trauma alone.
We have now come to the end of our session. Thank you all very much for your time, for your expertise, for your insights, and your willingness to answer some pretty hard questions. We've got plenty more, which will come to you all via email. So for those that have posed questions and we haven't yet managed to get to them, my apologies. We will get your answers soon. We will collate everything that's being shared with the panel, and any additional information, data, research, links that they have referenced in this korero. We will have them all in one package so that you all can follow up and then can continue to push for the change that is needed. And as the Under-Secretary said earlier, violence against women is unacceptable, not just women, girls, children, whoever are experiencing violence. And as a society, you know, tautoko Mele's key actions, you know, the actions for us as individuals and also as a collective, as a community, we have got to stand side by side and make sure that we are supporting those who are in need. And if we do see something that is not right, that we actually take a stand and speak up against the perpetrator or for the person that's in need of help. And it's only by working collectively, and you've heard from all of them about the power of the collective and the collaboration and the results that has eventuated during the lockdown. So my hope, and as have all been advocated or mentioned by our panelists, that through this collective action and the momentum that we have built during the lockdown, that progress will continue to be made. And I know that Superintendent Eric has got a lot of action points for the police side and also for the joint venture that's being set up. So I just want to say thank you all very much. Mele, thank you very much for sharing your lived experience. I think it's really, really important for people to see the impact, but also the strength that you have built as a result of the lived experience that you've had. And I applaud you for doing what you're doing. Please keep speaking up, and we are more than happy to work alongside you with the work that you're doing with White Ribbon, and also to make sure that you and women and you NANs can support you in whatever you do. And likewise with the rest of our panelists, Superintendent Eric, we might come to you for more questions with regards to this particular issue, and likewise Jan Logie, with the amazing work that you've been doing to really drive and get the legislation in place. So now it's all about implementation and making it happen and seeing the difference that you're seeking. So on behalf of the UNANs, to Julia and myself from UN Women New Zealand, thank you all very much for your time. All the very best for the rest of the week, and we will be in touch with the questions from our audience tonight. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.